If you use After Effects to make motion graphics and visual effects, this is the video that's going to help you switch to Fusion. So this is going to be a little bit more of an advice video. We'll jump into the interface in just a few minutes, but first of all, I want to say this. I have used After Effects for many years. My first real job was using After Effects. I used it professionally as a freelancer. I made motion graphics for broadcast. I did visual effects for short films, all kinds of stuff in After Effects. I got nothing against it. I think it's great. There's a Kool-Aid Jammer just sitting here. Get out of here, Kool-Aid Jammer. I had a party earlier. Got to have my KJs. So I love After Effects, but a few years ago, I switched from After Effects to Fusion. And I'm talking didn't open After Effects again, didn't use it ever again, uninstalled, unsubscribed, all of it. Why? Well, because Fusion's a pretty darn good replacement for After Effects. So what drove me to that kind of madness? Well, the biggest factor is that for editing, I had switched to DaVinci Resolve. And so when you're editing and doing color and everything in DaVinci Resolve, and you still need motion graphics and titles and visual effects and everything, round tripping to After Effects is sort of annoying because you'd have to export the clip and then bring it into After Effects, do your stuff, export it from After Effects, bring it back in. And ain't nobody got time for that. And you might say that if you worked in After Effects so much, why didn't you just edit in Premiere? Well, I used Premiere for a really long time as well. I started editing on Final Cut 5, I think, then went to 6, and then went to 7. And then once the Creative Suite apps kind of got a little bit better, I switched over to Premiere and it was lovely. But over the years, Premiere became less and less reliable. Was not to the point where it was sort of a chore to edit in Premiere. And switching to Resolve just overall had a lot less problems. So much less problems. Not to mention that Resolve is just the king of color correction. So good, so good. And I mean, I was shooting Blackmagic cameras anyway, but also things like S-Log and C-Log, V-Log. You want to be able to have a way to do your color grading that's actually really great. And there are some cool things about Lumetri, but it's just not even close to Resolve. I've been doing color grading in Resolve for a really long time and round tripping from Premiere into Resolve. In fact, I have some old videos on my channel of how to round trip from Premiere to Resolve. And so anyway, I'm working in Resolve for pretty much everything except for visual effects and graphics. And then they put Fusion into Resolve. That's when I said to myself, that's pretty interesting. And so when the first beta came out, I opened up Fusion, watched a tutorial, and then immediately closed Fusion and said, that looks really stupid. Why would they build it that way? How are you supposed to composite without layers? What the heck are these node things? That makes no sense. It feels like you have to do 50 extra steps to just do something really simple in Fusion. And so I just fought tooth and nail against switching to Fusion for a long time.
A long time.
But one day I sat down and I said, you know what? Even if this takes me a little bit to learn, if I don't have to round trip to After Effects and I can do at least some of the same things that I can do in After Effects right here in Fusion, and all I have to do is just click into the Fusion page and then I can adjust my clip and then move back to the edit page and it's already there. If that actually works how they say it works, and it's not too hard to actually learn Fusion, it's probably worth jumping into and trying. So I looked at some of the Blackmagic training. I opened it up and played around. And for a couple of weeks, I just kind of tried to learn it and tried to keep an open mind. And there really wasn't a lot of training available. There was some, but I kind of got in there and I messed around. And then one day, something amazing happened. Something in my brain snapped and I went insane. And I people. No, I'm just kidding. Don't put that in, Sam. That's not cool to say that. Keep it professional. But then one day something just clicked and I took a step back and I realized, is this actually a better way of compositing? Is using nodes not a drawback of Fusion, but an advantage? What the heck is going on? And that's when I realized that this tool is all of the things that I love about After Effects, but it's like twice as powerful. Because not only can you build the same stuff, you can actually do a lot more advanced things just because of the nature of how nodes work. And so nodes, even though they're kind of a pain to get your mind around, once you get your mind around them, they're a better way to work. And it's integrated in Resolve, so it's faster. And it's free. So I was like, dang, do I actually love this? And after that, it was just history, man. Within a couple weeks, I uninstalled After Effects and I just worked in Fusion. And I honestly haven't really missed After Effects. At least for the stuff that I do, which is a lot of short films and visual effects, a lot of titles and graphics and things like that, it just wasn't a big deal to switch to Fusion. So that's kind of like my little mini life story when it comes to Fusion and After Effects. And I want to give you a little tour of the interface. But before we do that, there's a couple acknowledgements that I want to make here because people are being in the comments just like getting ready to light me up here. One, the number one reason why you might not want to switch away from After Effects is because there aren't as many templates and plugins available for Fusion. That's because After Effects has been around for a long time. It's been a standard for a long time. People have made a ton of cool stuff for After Effects. You can get an After Effects template for cheap. You can get really great stuff. There's tutorials up the yin yang. There are so many resources for After Effects. It's easier to learn. There's more resources. It works with more stuff. There are pipelines like designed for it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why all of that stuff is very, very important. And I understand that. And so for your workflow, if you rely on templates and you rely on getting a new template every single week, you're not going to find as many and as wide of a variety of templates and stuff available for Fusion as you will for After Effects. Now, that is slowly changing. There are more and more resources and plugins and templates being made for Fusion every day. In fact, me and another person you might know, Mr. Alex Tech.
Hello.
We recently launched a website called Resolve Share, where creators can make plugins and templates and everything for Fusion and Resolve and share them. It's kind of a marketplace. That's kind of us doing our part to help kind of boost this community and get more people making these kind of community-made assets. But there's not as big of a variety. It's not as robust as the community for After Effects, and that might be a deal breaker for you. Now, does that mean that Fusion is a bad program or that it can't do the same things as After Effects does? No, it just means not as many people have made things for it yet. So that's big ol' acknowledgement number one. Big ol' acknowledgement number two is the fact that if you Google, is Fusion good for motion graphics? What you will probably come up with is a bunch of forums where people say things like, Fusion is great for visual effects, but it doesn't hold a candle to After Effects for motion graphics. This is something that just doesn't make any sense to me. I think where this comes from is people see a compositing app like Nuke, which is like big boy compositing. That's like what they use on Marvel movies and stuff like that. That is a visual effects compositor that is based on nodes. And Fusion has very, very similar tools. In fact, Fusion and Nuke are almost identical when it comes to like how you would lay out your nodes. They have very similar tools. And so Fusion is a very, very capable visual effects compositor, even for, big time effects. And so saying that Fusion is great for visual effects, that totally makes sense. But I think what happens is people look at the fact that there isn't as big of a community, there aren't as many plugins, and then you combine that with, where are the layers? There's no layers. How am I supposed to do graphics if I don't have layers? Actually, there are layers in Fusion. They're just not laid out in a layer panel. More on that in a little bit. And I think the last contributor to that opinion is that you can't directly open something like an Adobe Illustrator file in Fusion. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do vector art. There's ways to draw vector art inside of Fusion. You can import SVGs. You can even import Photoshop files with all their layers. And so there's quite a bit that you can do. It's just a little bit of a different workflow than just directly opening a Adobe Illustrator file. So those are kind of the big arguments that I see. But what's interesting is people take those ideas and they say, all right, that means that Fusion isn't good for motion graphics. And I'm like, that's not true. It can do just about everything After Effects can do, minus some special plugins and everything. So again, if you rely on those plugins, that might be a deal breaker for you. But if you're talking like vanilla After Effects versus vanilla Fusion, you can do essentially the same things. How do I know? Because I do it all the time. Doing a detailed 2D animation in After Effects takes a really long time and a lot of skill. And guess what? You can typically do the same thing in Fusion. Takes a lot of time, takes a lot of skill. So if you're this deep in the video and you're like, I haven't really used a lot of external plugins. I mostly just kind of do things within After Effects. I'm hoping to get rid of my subscription. I've opened up Resolve. I like editing in Resolve. I'm cool with switching. Then I'll show you around a little bit. All right, so here's the Fusion page in DaVinci Resolve. And if you're used to After Effects, the first thing you're gonna see is, oh no, there's nodes. Where's the timeline? Where's the layers? What do we do? The timeline is right here. So you can kind of scrub back and forth. This is where your playhead is. And so you can view your video up here, but the viewer is the same. And actually, if you go over here to the right, This is a lot like your effect controls, right? This is the inspector. So the inspector, anything that you have selected, you adjust the properties of it, just like effect controls. If you were to select a layer in After Effects and you would adjust its properties over here, same thing here for Fusion. Here's something else a little similar. If you go over here to the left and open up Media Pool, this is going to open up a panel that has all of the media that's in your project, which is a lot like your project panel, right? So you can grab a piece of media and drag it down in here, just like you would drag it to a timeline, but instead it makes a node. We'll talk about that in a second. But here's where all of the media for your project lives. You can also switch over to this button here and open up the effects, which is a lot like your effects panel in After Effects. You can scroll down and you can find all kinds of different effects that you can use. You can twirl down tools here and look at these subfolders. And to start out with, a lot of this you probably won't really recognize. But there are a couple things like blurs, things like color curves, right? Brightness and contrast. And so that's where you go and find your effects. And so there are some things that are similar that should feel relatively familiar. But let's talk about the nodes. So this is the big sticking point for a lot of people coming over from After Effects, people that are new to Fusion. If you've never used nodes before, they can be very intimidating, but I promise they're actually not that hard. It's more just looking at this and going, oh gosh, I'm lost. I don't even know what this means. What are all these little triangles for? I feel like I'm doing some kind of crazy science experiment instead of just stacking things up in layers. Well, let's get rid of all of these fancy things and just look at the two kind of starter nodes. When you're in the edit page and you have a clip on the timeline and you have your playhead over that clip, you can just click on Fusion and that will open up the clip in Fusion. It's kind of like the equivalent of what dynamic link is supposed to be for After Effects, except for this actually works. God, I'm so good. I'm just kidding, but not really. So it works reliably. Okay. I've had dynamic link work before. All right. It's worked several times in my life, in my lifetime. We can laugh about it now. It's funny. So when you open up a clip, you're going to have two nodes. Now, each one of these little boxes is called a node, and you link them together to make things happen. It's like a flowchart. Okay. So it starts out with this first node. This is called media in, and this last node is called media out. Now, each one of these little boxes has one job. And so it's like one primary task, one step for each box. So this first box, media in, its job is to open up the footage in Fusion. So that's why we can see the footage here. This second box, this second node, media out, its job is to render stuff to the timeline. And so by default, what we're doing is just running this through Fusion. Okay. So we're opening this up in Fusion and then we're putting it back into the timeline. So nothing is happening here in Fusion, but if we go over to the edit page, we'll see that we see our footage, just like we would expect. Now, if we were to do something to this footage, it would have to go on this line in between these two nodes. Now, to add a node, you can do this a bunch of different ways, but one quick way is to grab one of these icons and just grab it and drag it down into the node flow here, this flow chart. The one I'm going to grab is this blur node. So that's the 8th one over here. Looks like a little teardrop. I'll grab this and I can take it and just place this in between the two nodes. And as I mouse over this, it turns the line yellow and blue. When it does, I can let go of it like this, and that connects the blur in between these two nodes. I like to grab it and shake it around to make sure that these are actually linked, because sometimes this can be sitting perfectly on top of that line and it's not actually linked, which gets me a lot. But if you let it go right on that line and shake it around and it actually moves these connections, that means that this image is flowing through that effect, which means that it's actually adjusting the image. So now, just like in After Effects, I can select whatever effect that I want to change, and I can go over here to the inspector, which is like our effect controls, right? And I can adjust how it does its job. So I can push up this blur size, and now we have a blurry image. So we're doing this in steps. We're opening the footage, we're blurring it, and then we're putting it back into the timeline. And in fact, if I switch over to the edit page, look, we have a blurry piece of footage on our timeline. Now, don't miss the magic there, because did I render? Did I export? Did I switch apps? Did I save and come back and refresh or anything like that? Nope. All I did was switch to the other page and it's instantly there. It's already there. In fact, this is reading that Fusion composition in real time, just in the edit page. That's the magic. And so this is essentially how Fusion works, is you have the beginning and you have the end, and then everything else happens in between. Now, this is pretty easy to understand when it comes to effects, because really you're just putting effects on in order. So we want to blur it, and then maybe we want to use something like a brightness and contrast, and then desaturate it. So we're blurring it, then we're making it black and white, then we're rendering it back to the edit page. I could also make this black and white, and then blur it, and then put it on the edit page. I can choose that order. Now for this, it doesn't matter that much, but the order generally flows from left to right. Now, why is it going from left to right? Well, if you look really carefully, these connections, they're making little arrows. So we have this yellow arrow here that's pointing this way. And so each of these connections is making an arrow. And so that gives us an idea of what way the flow is going. In fact, we could make this exactly the same way by stacking these nodes top to bottom. And it's going to look exactly the same. Again, we just follow the direction of the arrows. They're all pointing down. And so we're starting with media in, and then we're doing brightness contrast, then we blur, then we render it back to the timeline. We can even go right to left if we want to. If we're some kind of crazy person, you could totally do that. If I want to get rid of either of these effects, I can just hit backspace with selecting them, and we'll just go back from left to right. And now we have the nodes kind of reset. So I think that's pretty easy to understand. We're just flowing this image through a pipeline. And whatever order we put those effects in, that's the order they're going to be applied. But the things that we do in After Effects aren't just putting color correction on stuff. It's compositing, which is putting things over other things. So in a world where there are no layers, how do you put something over something else when you don't have any way to stack things? That's like inherently a problem. Well, let's make something to put over this. Let's just make some text, which works a lot like it does in After Effects. In After Effects, you'll make like a new text layer. Here, you'll just make a text node. Just grab this T and bring it down into the graph here. I can select this text and type in whatever text I want, some text. But now I don't see the text. We're used to, if you make a layer and you put it over another layer, that you immediately see that on top of the other layer. This is on top. What the heck? Do we run it through it? How does that work? Well, now we just see the text, and what the heck is going on? Why did they build Fusion this way? Let's quit and go home. Well, don't worry. There's a couple reasons why you don't see this text yet. And the actual technical reason is that this isn't connected at all. What we're doing right now is we're looking at whatever is being fed to the media out. That's just kind of the default way that you look at things in Fusion. That's how Fusion is kind of set up out of the box default. What's happening in this viewer is actually being fed from the media out right here. The reason I know that is because one, it says media out right here. And two, there's this little white dot right there. So what the heck? What am I talking about looking at this viewer? Well, the thing that's crazy about Fusion is that you can view the result of any of these nodes on this viewer. And in fact, if we hit this little button right here, we can open up and we have two viewers. So I could take this text and I could hit 1 on the keyboard, and that's going to load this in the first viewer. So this is the first viewer. This is the second viewer. You can also take any of these nodes and just drag them into the viewer like that. But yeah, by default, we're looking at media out, which a lot of the time is what you want to look at. But this is one of the advantages of nodes and how Fusion is set up, is you can look at the little parts before you put them together. So you can kind of look at the little pieces of things separately, which helps you stay organized and helps you kind of figure things out. How many times have you disabled layers and everything in After Effects just to be able to focus on one part? That makes it really easy. So now we have this text, and let's say we want to put it over this footage. How the heck do we do that? Well, remember, every node has a job. So what we need is a node that does the job of putting an image over another image. So that lives right here. That's called a merge node. And so we can take this merge node and plug this in right here in between our media in and media out. And then we can put the text into the merge. Now, how this works is you can grab this little gray square here, you grab it and drag, and that will drag an output. And you take this output and you put it into the green input of the merge, and look what happens. Now we have text over it. All right. We can select the text and adjust the size and all of that stuff, just like you would in After Effects. The only difference is that you have to use this merge node instead of just adding this to a layer stack. Now, this is the point that the first time I looked at Fusion, I said, that's stupid.
Is it supposed to be stupid?
That's a stupid way to do it.
It's not stupid. It's advanced.
Why would I waste my time making an extra merge node? Like, I mean, just for the most simple thing, putting something over something else. That's like the easiest possible thing to do in compositing. And I have to like meticulously hook stuff up in order to just do that. This is going to take 90 hours to do anything. Well, it's not as bad as all that. Just because I've been explaining things as I go, I'm kind of showing you the slow way. So this is the way that nobody who actually uses Fusion really does it. Nobody grabs a merge node for the most part and then connects it like this, just because that takes a long time and it's kind of annoying, right? What happens more often is you'll take the output of this text and you can drag this over the little white square, the output of the media in, and look what happens. It makes a merge node and puts it on automatically, okay? What's even faster is if we don't have this text here, we can select whatever node we want to put this text over. So I'll just select this media in 1, and I can just hit this text button right here, boop, and that will add the text with a merge. And now my text is over the background, okay? So it's not quite as annoying as it seems like it is to begin with. And so a lot of the time I find myself grabbing some text, bringing it into this left viewer, some text, and then putting it over where I want. And it just doesn't take that long once you get used to it. And so if that's like the big deal breaker for you, I encourage you to just take a few minutes and practice just adding things with a merge, because it's really not that bad. And a merge, this is how you put any image over another image. What's confusing for a lot of people, especially coming from After Effects, is that this is not how you add an effect to an image. So if you're going to add curves or color correction or brightness and contrast or something like that, or a blur onto something, you don't put it on top of something. Even though in After Effects, you're used to the idea of dropping an effect on something. In Fusion, you run images through effects. To change how a picture looks, we got to run it through an effect.
Oh, to change how my picture looks, I gotta run it through an effect.
So if I want to color correct this whole thing, I can grab a color corrector and run everything through this color corrector. And now I can push this to be blue and everything gets this blue color correction. Let's make this text a different color actually, just so we can see it. So I'll make this text like a yellow, like this. Reset our color corrector. So we have this yellow text, and as I move this blue, it kind of neutralizes it. And so that color correction is being applied to the background as well as the text, because the text is being put over the background and then we're color correcting it. Again, it goes in this direction, right? It goes along the flow. So again, this seems more complicated, but it's actually a better way to work. Because think about how many times in After Effects you've been like, okay, well, I want this color correction over a group of layers. And so you would maybe use an adjustment layer. This is essentially like an adjustment layer, right? Everything that runs into this color corrector gets color corrected. If I want to color correct something by itself, I just do it before it gets merged. So I can take this color corrector, I'm just holding Shift to bring this out of the flow and drop it back in. And now I can do that color correction without affecting my text. And if you've been paying attention, you can actually kind of see that we still do have layers here in Fusion. It's just not set up with a layer panel. Now, how does that work? Well, this is layer 1. This is layer 2. This is layer 3. So it just kind of goes from left to right because we're still stacking things on top of each other. So this is footage. This is an adjustment layer. And this is a text layer. They just go from left to right instead of bottom to top. Okay, but what about animation? We don't have a timeline with layers and the keyframes and everything to move around, right? Well, actually we do. If we go up here to this button and click on keyframes, that'll open up our keyframes panel. And sometimes by default, there's this little menu here and we have animated checked right here. So if we uncheck animated, that's going to give us something that looks an awful like the After Effects timeline. The only difference is that these aren't really set up in layers. This is just a list of all of the nodes in our flow. But going from left to right, we have our playhead. And if we animate things, we're going to be able to see the keyframes here. So how do we keyframe stuff? Well, I can keyframe this text, I'll just select the text, go over to this second icon here, and let's grab the center. So the center adjusts where this text is. It's like the position of the text, right? And I can add a keyframe. This should be somewhat familiar. There's a little icon here. And if I click that, that's going to add a keyframe. And now look what's happening down here. We have a little white tick mark. That is a keyframe for the layout center of our text. And so I can move to the beginning of our shot, and let's take the layout center and take this text down. And as we go forward in time, this moves up to that next keyframe. So it really works pretty much the same way After Effects does, just the keyframes are kind of in their own panel. They're not in the main timeline. And these aren't set up in layers. The actual layers and everything are controlled by the layout of the nodes. So this keyframes, this is basically just the timing of the animation. And it's also kind of the ins and out points of the footage. So I can grab this footage and move this back and forth and kind of do my ins and outs just like you would in After Effects. I can grab the edges here and trim this in a very similar way. The thing that's less intuitive is that it's just kind of broken up a little bit. So this is pretty much just timing, and this is the layout of the layers. Now, if I want to ease these keyframes, I can do that a few ways, but I think the best way is to open our spline panel. Now, our spline panel is pretty much like the graph editor in After Effects. All I have to do is select what I want to view, so this displacement, and then there's this button right here which sets our zoom. Click on that, and now we have this graph of our animation. And this should look very familiar if you've ever used the graph editor. I can select either of these keyframes and I can adjust the handles, and I can flatten them just by selecting them and hitting F on the keyboard. And that's going to ease my curves. So I have a way to animate our text as well as adjust the animation and the easing. It's just in a slightly different place. And so all of the timing and everything happens with the spline and the keyframes panels, and you just only open them when you need them. The rest of the time, you're doing a lot of work just in the nodes and in the inspector, which anytime that you have a node selected, you just adjust its properties in the inspector. If you need to bring in a different shot or a still or some kind of graphic or whatever, you can go to your media pool and grab that footage and just drag this in, and that's going to make another media in. And you can view this on either viewer. And now we have this. And again, we can just merge it over by dragging the output over the output like that. And I can do any kind of adjustment that I would expect to be able to do in After Effects by selecting one of these nodes and adjusting its properties. Now, something to mention about when you put an image over another image with a merge. In After Effects, if you were to make a layer, that layer has certain properties like size and rotation and that kind of thing. In Fusion, it's broken out a little bit where this media itself doesn't really have those properties. It doesn't have scale and rotation. It doesn't have transform properties. The transform properties actually live in the merge that it's attached to. And so if I select this merge and adjust the size, that's how we would adjust that. Because really this merge, this is adjusting how that image goes over the background image. That's its job, is to figure out how to do it. This is the image it's using. We're connecting it to the green input, which is the foreground input. And then the merge determines how that happens. Now, normally what I would recommend is that instead of doing this in the merge, you run it through a transform node. So a transform node, again, it's just kind of a separated way to control things. So this icon almost in the middle, this is a transform node. I can grab this and drag it in. Again, make sure that it's connected. And now that transform node will do pretty much the same thing that that merge does, but here's the difference. Here's the big change in mindset that I really recommend that you try and have. The advantage of nodes is that you can see everything that's happening in your comp without having to open up the properties of layers, without having to dig in. How many times have you opened up an After Effects project maybe that somebody else did, and you're just completely lost? And it takes you like 2 hours to figure out what the heck is even going on because everything's kind of hidden and twirled up or, hidden in several pre-comps and everything like that. Here, it's all laid out. You can see all the steps, like it's all laid out on the table. Okay. And so with this transform, this adjustment that we're making to the size and maybe moving this over here for a picture-in-picture thing, we could rename this transform and call this PIP for picture-in-picture _XF for transform. Hit OK. And then we know that this is what's controlling that picture-in-picture. We can turn this off and on and see what it looks like without it or with it. And so in some ways, it's sort of like a adjustment layer, but it's even more powerful because it can do all kinds of transformations and crazy stuff to whatever you run through it, and you can turn it on or off at any time. You might be used to parenting things to a null object if you want to kind of group a bunch of stuff. There aren't null objects here in Fusion, but you can put 100 nodes, merge them all together and put them through one transform. So we could say this transform right here, and its anchor point is right here in the middle. Its pivot point is right here in the middle. And so if I take this and I rotate it, look at that. We can rotate around that point, just like you would parent something to a null object and rotate it. Kind of a similar idea. You can scale it. You can do all the things that you would normally do just by parenting something to a null object. You do that just by running it through a transform. And again, you can kind of break these out into the little pieces to where you can adjust them and animate them differently and do all kinds of crazy stuff. And worst case, you mess something up and you're like, I don't like that. You can just turn off this one adjustment or delete it altogether, and you still have the other things that you've done. Okay, this video is getting plenty long. I want to show you one more thing that you're probably used to in After Effects and kind of how it works in Fusion, and that is masking. Now, in After Effects, you make a layer and you draw a mask on that layer to kind of crop things, right? Well, it works a similar way in Fusion. Let's just take this media into and drag this to the left viewer. I can select this media into, and I can pick one of these icons here, and this will add a mask to that media. So let's just add an ellipse mask. I'll just click that once, and that's going to add that to that piece of media. And it works pretty much like it does in After Effects, right? You can move this around, you can adjust it, rotate it, do all those things. But look what's happening in the nodes. What we have is our media in, and this mask isn't hidden inside of this layer. You don't have to twirl it down or find any masks or anything. It's right here on the table. The ellipse mask is a separate node that's just attached to this blue input. Again, it's so that you can see it, so you can see what's going on. And so you could rename this mask, headlights, MSK, right? You can mask this headlight. Let's just say headlight L. So left headlight mask. And I could copy and paste this mask just by dragging it up, Control C, Control V. We'll rename this. I'm just hitting F2 to rename it. And we'll take this right headlight mask and put that here. And by default, those masks will add together. And so that we have this mask that we're applying to our media and just cutting out those headlights. And here's what's really, really cool. This is the thing that just gets me going about nodes. Let's say you really like this mask and you want to copy it and put it on this media for whatever reason. Normally in After Effects, what you would do would be to grab the masks and copy them, right? And you can do that here. I could select both of these masks, Control C, double click off, Control V, and then I can take this output and plug it into the media in like that. I can totally do that. And that would work the same way. If you still want to do that, that's fine. But here's what's magical. I could take the output of this and I can drag multiple outputs from any node, and I can just plug this into the media in, and I don't even have to duplicate it. It uses that same mask for multiple things. And so I could take this mask and move it around, and it's going to move around on both of those layers. Isn't that nuts? That's so cool. So the little bit of speed that you lose by just having to make a node for everything, you gain in being able to use the nodes for multiple things, and also not having to guess what the heck is going on in your pre-comp within a pre-comp within a pre-comp. It's all laid out here in the nodes.
It's about
The nodes. So let's take all of this and let's make something practical. Let's make just some really basic animated titles. Let's do the equivalent of making an After Effects composition. I'm going to go up here to the media pool and right click in the empty space and go to New Fusion Composition. And we'll just call this Title 1. And then I double click on this Title 1 and that'll open up a new Fusion composition. The only difference here is that we don't have a media in. That's because this isn't living in the timeline. It's kind of its own brand new thing that we're starting from scratch. Let's say we want to make a colored background. In After Effects, you would start with a colored solid, right? In Fusion, that's this icon right here, this background icon. Grab this, and this is essentially making a solid, all right? So let's maybe we'll make this kind of a blue, teal looking thing. Take the output of this and plug this into media out, and that's what's going to be rendered to the timeline, okay? We don't have this in a timeline yet. We're kind of making it as like its own composition, that it's its own source. It just lives here in the media pool. It's just making a separate composition that we can use later. So there's our teal solid, which is just called a background. Maybe you've used something like fractal noise to add some clouds. Well, right next to this is a node called fast noise. Pretty much the same thing. So if I bring this up on the left, push up the detail, push up the scale, this is fractal noise. I can take the output of this, put it into the output of our background, and now we have our cloudy background here. Maybe I want to turn down the opacity of this layer. We do that by selecting the merge, and we go to this property called blend. Take this blend and down like that. That's just our opacity. So we'll just take that down a little bit like that, just to kind of break this up. Let's actually select this fast noise and push the scale down a little bit, just to make that, just to break up the background a touch. Now we want to get some text. Grab this third icon over this text. And again, just merge it over like that. Take this text and we'll just say title 1. Pick my font. There we go. Making our text. And I just set the text size. And let's have this text kind of drop out of nothing. We can select our text and add a mask just by clicking on maybe this rectangle like this. That'll add a rectangle mask. So that's going to draw the text only within this mask. I'll just make the mask just big enough to go over our text, and then select our text, go to layout, and I can animate this center. And we'll go to frame 20 or so, put a keyframe on center, go back to frame 0, and then we'll push the center up. We'll just grab this and push this way. So now we have it coming down out of nothing. See what we're doing? Just like After Effects, but we want that to slow down. Normally we would just easy ease that. Instead, I'm going to go over to Spline, Displacement, make sure to click this button so that we can see the whole graph, and grab this last keyframe and hit F on the keyboard for flatten. Now we have that coming in and slowing down before it stops. Yeah, buddy. Maybe we want a little drop shadow on this. Again, just like you would add an effect to a layer, I'm just going to run this text through an effect called shadow. And we're going to push that offset around. Now we have our drop shadow like that. Beautiful. See what we're doing here? And you can continue building your title just like this in Fusion, just like you would in After Effects. It just takes a little bit of getting used to building with merges instead of just dragging in layers, running images through effects instead of putting effects on layers, connecting masks to these blue inputs instead of putting the mask on a layer. Really, everything is kind of spread out and separated a little bit more than it is in After Effects, but it's for a reason. It's so that you can easily figure out what's going on, and everything's built to be really modular. There is so much more to show you about Fusion. If you want more, make sure to let me know in the comments. But I also have a free workshop. It's about 2 hours long where we walk through the basics of making motion graphics in Fusion. And there's also a link to our motion graphics starter pack, which comes with textures and fonts and color palettes and over 1,200 sound effects to help you make awesome stuff in Fusion. Boy, I didn't even touch on the vector system or the 3D system or the particles. But if you're switching to Fusion from After Effects, welcome.